In the rocky highlands of Jordan and the shimmering deserts of Saudi Arabia lie the remains of two fabled cities, Petra and Hegra. Cut from the very rock, these towering buildings are so dreamlike, it is hard to believe they actually exist. The people who built them were known as the Nabateans. Much of their story has faded from history, but these astounding tombs and temples hold profound secrets about their way of life.
In this society, it seems that there was a high status for women.
Ancient inscriptions and new discoveries suggest that women wielded unrivaled power in the lost kingdom of the Nabateans.
It makes it very clear that women have absolutely equal ownership rights with men.
Most of the ancient world was controlled by men, but was the kingdom of Nabatea dominated by a lost matriarchy? The Wadi Araba Desert, eastern Jordan. This is a desolate and unforgiving place, but it was once the hub of a great network of roads. For centuries before and after Christ, caravans, camels, and people crossed this wilderness. They were traders, carrying valuable goods between Africa, the Far East, and the Mediterranean.
The location of Nabatea is central to the routes coming from Arabia, going up to Syria, the Mediterranean, and Egypt.
The traders dealt in many different types of goods, but most of all they supplied the precious items that were in huge demand for medicine and religious rituals: frankincense and myrrh. These incenses were used by every religion in the ancient world, from Rome to Athens to Jerusalem, and they were key ingredients in ancient medicine. Whoever controlled the trade in frankincense and myrrh stood to make a lot of money.
The Nabateans started as a nomadic tribe who had no settled base. When you do that, you have to know where your water sources are, because it means that you have to move your flocks and your herds to places where there are water.
Using their secret knowledge of the water sources, the Nabateans were able to cross the desert in the shortest possible time.
And of course, where you save time, you save a lot of money, and they became extremely rich.
The incense road started in southern Arabia and traveled northwards through the Arabian Peninsula. The Nabateans controlled the crucial final stages of this route, which ended at the ports of the Mediterranean.
And so the Nabateans took advantage of their position amid this landscape and grew very, very wealthy over the course of a relatively short span of time.
Little by little, they came to dominate the region. Eventually, they settled down and began to build cities, centers of power where they could control trade even more effectively. By 150 BC, they had established a vibrant kingdom of commerce. At the intersection of several important trading routes, the Nabateans built an astonishing city carved from red sandstone, Petra. Its name means simply rock. It is a wonderland of fabulous buildings, tombs and temples dedicated to the Nabatean gods. Familiar to millions of Indiana Jones fans, the carved facade of the majestic treasury guards the entrance to Petra. Then there is the starkly beautiful monastery, hewn into the sandstone cliffs to the west, and the stately urn tomb, the imposing mausoleum of a Nabatean ruler. As striking as this place looks today, we can only guess at what it must have been like in its heyday. the decades just before and after the birth of Christ.
It was a flourishing metropolis. Judging by the size of the theater, we would say that there were around 30,000 people living here. This may not be a large number by modern standards, but if we consider that Rome, the largest city of that time, was only 1 million people, then this would have been a major city as well.
To carve the tombs and temples, the city's builders used an unusual but highly effective technique. Starting from high on the rock face, they worked their way downwards, cutting away the stone as they went. This is how they fashioned the elaborate and beautiful sandstone tomb facades. Petra was built from the top down.
2,000 years ago, as Nabatean, they live in the mountain, they carve. There is many different things. Today, there is many things change,
The city now seems arid and parched, a place of rock and dust. It's hard to imagine that water ever flowed here. But 2,000 years ago, it was a man-made oasis.
Well, water was, of course, very important for the Nabateans because in a desert environment like southern Jordan or modern-day Saudi Arabia, there aren't many natural water resources simply available. But the Nabateans, like a lot of Arabian peoples, had to learn to capture and harvest and harness natural water resources that they did have.
The Nabateans took some of their water from the springs that dotted the enclosing mountains. But there was another vitally important source. Every winter, this region sees storms and torrential rainfall. The Nabateans became experts in water conservation. To ensure that not a drop of the precious liquid was wasted, Nabatean engineers devised an ingenious system of dams, channels, and reservoirs. They transformed Petra from a dry and dusty wasteland into an idyllic place. People lived, worked, loved, and died in this thriving wilderness paradise.
Without water, there's no life, and it's so important here, especially in this arid climate. And you need huge amounts of water for all these caravans going through.
The Nabateans prospered and multiplied. But as their city grew, the demands for water became ever greater. When the supply slowed to a trickle after a long and arid year, they sought aid from a divine force, not a god, but a goddess. The Nabateans worshipped three powerful female deities: the goddess Al-Uzza, the powerful one; Alat, whose name means simply goddess; and Manat, the goddess of fate. The people of Petra venerated them at their great shrines and temples.
The Nabateans themselves who lived within Petra seem to have worshipped in particular the goddess Al-Uzza, who is simply termed the mightiest, as we would translate in English.
Long before the rise of Islam, Al-Uzza was worshipped across the entire Arabian Peninsula. Her image has been found throughout Petra, carved on small blocks of stone. For centuries, the Nabateans used blocks to represent their deities. On some of these blocks, they carved basic features: eyes and perhaps a nose. These images are known as eye idols.
Based on inscriptions we have around Petra and other Nabatean sites, this type of figurine is typically associated with Al-Uzza.
Al-Uzza was directly linked with Petra's ever-present need for water. Right at the entrance to Petra, there is a winding corridor of rock, the Sikh. After many twists and turns, it arrives at an awesome facade of carved pillars, pediments, and statues. This incredible place is known as the Treasury. Many believe that it is the tomb of a Nabatean king, Aretas IV. But some say it is not a king's tomb, but a shrine, the sanctuary of the city's greatest deity. A figure stands on the cupola that overlooks the entrance. It is worn down by many centuries of desert wind, rain, and sun. Today, it is hard to make out much detail, but all experts agree that it is not the statue of a king or a god. It is the statue of a woman, a goddess. Standing on the facade of Petra's greatest building, she represents the fortunes and spirit of the city. But she is also important for another reason. Directly beneath her, on the building's triangular pediment, is the symbol of Isis, the Egyptian goddess of fertility. Isis is the direct counterpart of the Nabatean goddess Al-Uzza, and like her Egyptian sister goddess, Al-Uzza was responsible for fertility and rainfall. The Nabateans prayed to Al-Uzza for precious life-giving water. This could be why symbols of the goddess are found all over Petra. And she could be linked with the city's largest and most imposing monument, a massive sacred site known as the monastery. Many scholars believe that the monastery was built to honor a dead Nabatean king. But astrophysicist Juan Antonio Belmonte has verified that a remarkable manifestation takes place here during the winter solstice. This extraordinary new discovery could change everything we thought we knew about Petra, Al-Uzza, and the city's eternal prayer for water. The tombs and temples of ancient Petra contain symbols of potent goddesses, symbols that may reflect real female power in the Nabatean kingdom. In a city of stupendous monuments, one of the most breathtaking looms high on the sandstone cliffs to the west. Today it is known as the monastery, but originally this was a sacred temple, one of Petra's most important ceremonial centers. A clue to the purpose of the monastery can be found in a mysterious building a short distance further down the mountainside. In ancient times, this place was used as a dining room, but it also had a sacred purpose. Over the entrance, there are the remains of a round opening. Astrophysicist Juan Antonio Belmonte is studying alignments between Petra's monuments and objects in the sky. In 2015, he discovered something incredible here, something that had been forgotten for many centuries. Like Stonehenge in England and Newgrange in Ireland, this small chamber is aligned with the midwinter sun. On the morning of the winter solstice, sunlight enters dead center through this special opening. The alignment proves just how sacred this place was. At the time of the solstice, a great procession of believers came here to celebrate the sunrise. But the ritual did not end there. The lions that guard the entrance to the chamber have a special significance. And this was why the Nabateans continued their ritual further up the mountain at the monastery. Some say that the monastery was the temple of an important Nabatean god or goddess. Others that it was a shrine for a deified king. No one knows for sure, but Juan hopes to witness a phenomenon that will unravel this mystery.
The Nabateans were trade people, so they moved caravans from the south of Arabia to the Mediterranean.
To navigate the desert sands, the Nabateans needed to understand the movements of heavenly bodies, the stars, the moon, and the sun. Juan has discovered that the monastery too is aligned with the sun during the solstice. For the Nabatean people, This was vitally important.
The sun enters the monastery at that precise moment and produces a very nice light and shadow effect.
If Juan's theories are correct, then the monastery was not just a tomb or a temple. It was something even more important. The great rectangular entrance is specially designed so that when the sun is setting during the solstice, it falls directly on the altar, leaving everything else in shadow.
This is probably not by chance. I mean, this is a design.
From the vantage point of the altar, a priest or religious official would have been able to make out a silhouette against the solstice sunlight. A rock shaped like the head of a lion, defined in black against the setting sun. The lion is the sacred animal of Al-Uzza. Did the Nabateans worship her during the solstice, gazing with awe at the lion's head rock? What happens next is even more dramatic.
So the sun first sets on the top of the rock, and then it suddenly reappears for a few moments, a little bit to the right of the previous position. This is what we call in astronomy a double sunset.
The double sunset allowed the Nabateans to determine the exact moment of the solstice with clinical precision. And this event heralded the power that the goddess was about to unleash. Like many other female deities in the Middle East and the Mediterranean, Al-Uzza was in charge of fertility. This meant that she was responsible for rainfall. The winter solstice signaled when the rain was about to arrive, when the land would become fertile, and when water would return again to the parched city. So when the Nabateans saw the sacred lion of Al-Uzza appear against the light of the midwinter sun, they knew a downpour was not far off.
And this would, at the same time, produce a relationship between the goddess herself, I mean between Al-Uzza, and the arrival of the rains.
The rain the goddess brought was sacred, and this explains why water is associated with virtually every tomb and hallowed structure within Petra, and why the Nabateans took such care to manage this valuable source. Al-Uzza may have been the mightiest of all the Nabatean gods and goddesses, but did this divine power game also play out on Earth? What sort of status did Nabatean women have compared to their men? In the center of Petra stand the remains of another temple, a raised altar surrounded by clusters of broken columns. This is the Temple of the Winged Lions, named after the carved winged lions that once adorned the columns. This, too, was a temple of Al-Uzza. A unique eye idol was discovered here. Ornately carved, it is a striking image of a goddess. Because it was found amid the rubble of the temple, archaeologists believe that the place was dedicated to Al-Uzza. Everything about the temple suggests that it was a place of mysterious ritual, where the cult of Al-Uzza worshipped the goddess, burning incense and chanting. This sacred podium was specially designed so the image of the goddess could be kept hidden from sight until the moment of climax.
And then very dramatically pulling the curtains away, and then suddenly you come face to face with the visual image of the goddess Al-Uzza sitting atop the cultic podium.
Priestesses would have played an important part in these rituals. Al-Uzza's great status suggests that Nabatean women, too, were important in this society. Certainly, they had far greater rights and freedoms than the women of Europe or the Roman world. The Nabateans did not leave many written documents behind, but the records that do survive provide amazing evidence of the power and status of women, and they hint at something astonishing. For a time, at least, women were in control here. In 1961, a team of archaeologists discovered a mysterious set of documents hidden in southern Israel. Like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the documents had lain forgotten in a cave for around 2,000 years. They reveal astonishing information about the life of a Nabatean woman called Abiadan, who lived in the 1st century AD. The scrolls show that she owned an orchard of date trees at Mahatsa, near the Dead Sea. Today, the documents are held by the Israel Antiquities Authority. Hannah Cotton of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem is an expert on these unique scrolls.
Abiadan is a Nabatean woman, and there are two documents. They're interesting documents because she's selling the same orchard to one person and then to another.
The document shows that Abiadan could read and write, and that her property adjoined the lands of the Nabatean king himself. There is no doubt that she was a wealthy and influential woman.
These are mainly legal documents. This is not a diary of a woman. But all the time I feel that behind the documents dictated to scribes, there are women who know what they want. The sense you get out of her documents is that she was completely independent.
It seems that in Nabatea, women could own property, they could transfer property. They had it's a bit of sociological jargon, but women had agency in this period. They had rights, they had the power to do things.
Women living in other parts of the ancient world could only dream of these privileges. But in Nabatea, women had extraordinary status. To find out more, we must explore other writings that have survived from this time. These inscriptions are found in a fabulous golden city, all but forgotten amid the sands of Saudi Arabia. In the remote wilderness of Saudi Arabia, there is another stupendous city of stone. It is called Madain Salih, but some know it by its old name, Hegra. After Petra, this was the second city of the Nabatean kingdom, located on the southern periphery of the realm. The location is no accident. Hegra had an abundant supply of the one thing most needed to survive in the desert: water. This was a great oasis, boasting as many as 130 wells. But there was another, more profitable reason for Hegra's existence. It was strategically placed on a great commercial highway, the incense route. Caravans and bands of traders passed up and down this road, hauling precious incense from southern Arabia to the ports of the Mediterranean. For the Nabatean people of Hegra, there were enticing business opportunities.
They wanted to create a base that was at the most southerly point of their area of control. And so they made this base at Hegra, a place with wonderful sandstone mountains that probably reminded them of Petra.
Hegra grew prosperous. By the time of the birth of Christ, it was a wealthy and bustling city. The most powerful and wealthy inhabitants created striking tombs for themselves and their families. Carved from great chunks of sandstone, these awesome monuments offer the best evidence for what life was like in the city and the unique role of women. Some of the tomb entrances are guarded by monstrous heads, placed here to ward off evil spirits. Over a third of them have inscriptions, messages that set out strict penalties for anyone who should dare to interfere with the tomb. But what is more amazing is what the inscriptions tell us about the tomb's owners.
These inscriptions are legal texts, and one of the inscriptions says very explicitly that the inscription on the tomb is a copy of a papyrus document which was kept in an archive. What we think was going on was that there were ownership documents related to each of these tombs, and a summary of the ownership document was written up as an inscription on the facade of the tomb.
This group of tombs is known as the Palace of the Maiden. It is a fitting name. These places offer tantalizing glimpses into the lives of Hegra's women. Because as the inscriptions show, many of the tombs were owned not by men, but by women. The inscriptions prove something remarkable. Abiadan, the female landowner who lived near the Dead Sea, was no exception. The Nabatean women of Hegra also owned property. In fact, they may have possessed a quarter of the tombs in this amazing ancient cemetery.
The interesting thing about the tomb inscriptions at Madain Saleh, it makes it very clear that women have absolutely equal ownership rights with men. There are one or two cases where the female side of the family actually own 2/3 of the tomb, and the male members smaller 1/3 of the tomb.
But again, it shows the real estate, legalistic aspect of these inscriptions. It's defining precisely who owns which bit of property.
But the privileges of Nabatean women went beyond simple ownership of tombs. Some took on important roles as guardians or protectors. A woman called Wasuch, daughter of Bajrat, owned one of the tombs. The head of a large family that included 5 daughters, she enjoyed great status in Hegra. She is identified as the protector of several people. We do not know the names of these people, but we do know that some of them were men. Wasuch was responsible for them and their property. They may even have lived under her roof. Wasuch could have been a tribal leader, possessing as much authority as any male chieftain. At the very least, she was a powerful and influential woman. Women could wield even greater power, power over other human beings. Slavery was not widely practiced in the Nabatean kingdom, but it did exist, and fragments of evidence from around this region show that some women were slave owners.
I mean, there were some slaves, but it wasn't an extensive practice. A woman owning a slave at home, like a servant at home, wouldn't have been a problem.
From one end of the realm to the other, Nabatean women owned land, tombs, and even slaves. These females exerted remarkable influence and authority. This idea is reinforced by one of Hegra's most striking symbols, something that connects the city back to Petra and the mighty goddess who is venerated in the Nabatean capital. This tomb facade is perhaps the most elaborate of all. Richly decorated by carved columns and capitals, the entrance is guarded by 2 sphinxes, winged lions with female faces. The lion was the sacred animal of the goddess Al-Uzza, and statues of this kind once stood in Petra's temple of the winged lions. It is as if the power of Al-Uzza and the women she represented is also highlighted here at Hegra. Now, one of these sacred sites has yielded up its secrets. This is the tomb of Kamkam, who lived at Hegra around the time of the birth of Christ. She was a priestess at a local temple, dedicated to an important Nabatean god or goddess. The inscription tells us that she and her daughter made the tomb for themselves and their descendants. It also gives the names of Kamkam's mother and grandmother. Cam and her daughter traced 4 generations of descent through the female side of their family.
And that suggests a kind of descent or claim to importance through her mother rather than through her father, which is far more normal.
So where were the men? In a time when most societies were patriarchies, how did the women become so powerful? The answer is found in the story of precious incense, the very reason for Hegra's existence. 2,000 years ago, in the 1st century AD, the Nabatean women of Petra and Hegra had privileges that were virtually unheard of in other countries. But how did they attain this status at a time when most societies were patriarchies? The answer lies in the very thing that allowed the Nabatean kingdom to exist in the first place: trade. The Nabateans were highly skilled at transporting merchandise. They sourced goods from all corners of the known world and shipped them hundreds of miles across the scorching deserts. And they did not deal in everyday items. The Nabateans specialized in transporting luxury goods, especially incense. Frankincense and myrrh were vital components in the religious rituals of ancient societies. Frankincense was also a cure-all medicine, the ancient equivalent of penicillin.
Incense was used by very many people in the area. It was a multi-purpose commodity and greatly valued.
Frankincense and myrrh could only be found many hundreds of miles away, at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula.
They had 2 trips a year, one in winter to the south, to Yemen, and one in the summer to the north, to Syria. So the men are expected to be away for almost half of the year.
You can imagine that if your husband was absent for long, long periods on a caravan trip, then maybe this would have created circumstances in which women had to take a legal role.
Free from male interference, Nabatean women found they could operate independently as property owners, slave owners, and leaders in society. Echoes of this liberated time still resonate in the present day. The Bedouin, the desert tribes of Arabia, still reside near Petra. Some Bedouin trace their ancestry back to the Nabateans. Manal al-Fakir belongs to the Bedouin, the Bedouin tribe most closely associated with Petra. She feels that Bedouin women today should have the same rights as their ancient ancestors.
As a woman to live with a Bedouin, there is no freedom. Because the woman here, she have to work, she have to clean, she have to cook, she have to do many things, and the man, he couldn't do nothing. For me, it's different. I have more open-minded. I prefer when I get married, I need my husband to share with me life, to cook with me, to do many things with me. But me, because I work with the tourism, I get different mind, more open-minded. And this is nice, help, you know, make you to see, you feel more a human being to, as a woman, to live in this life.
Some Nabatean women trace descent on the female side of the family, demonstrating their power and status in society. In doing so, they may have been hearkening back to an earlier time, hundreds of years before the rise of the Nabateans, when great queens ruled in Arabia. The most famous of these monarchs was the Queen of Sheba, who lived 1,000 years before Christ. The Bible tells us that she visited King Solomon, bringing presents of gold, jewels, and spices. The Nabateans also had queens, strong-willed women who wielded extraordinary power. Traces of their status can still be found in the Nabatean capital, Petra. Aretas IV was king of Nabatea from 9 BC to 40 AD. He presided over the kingdom's golden age of prosperity and wealth. Many believe that he built Petra's greatest monuments, including this splendid theater, where thousands gathered to watch open-air performances. But Aretas's claim to the throne depended on a woman. He was related to Hagar, the daughter of a previous king of Nabatea. Hagar may have had an equal say in the running of the kingdom. The evidence for this is found not on monuments or inscriptions, but on small and seemingly insignificant items of currency. Coins. The Numismatics Museum in Amman holds a huge collection of Nabatean coins. These small discs of metal give amazing hints of the power games that went on in the Nabatean monarchy.
Depicting figures of busts of the queens on the Nabatean coins, it reflects that the Nabateans, they respect their women, or they respect their queens.
The queen appears on the coins in 3 different ways. Sometimes the queen's head is seen side by side with the king's. On the other coins, her head appears on its own on the reverse of the coin. And on some, the queen can be seen standing on her own.
At first, there were figures of queens on coins, but no names were mentioned. From the time of Aretas IV, around 9 BC, the queens are mentioned in names. Their portraits are either next to the king or on opposite sides, and they are mentioned by name as queens of the Nabateans. This tradition went on consistently for well over a century. Now, this is unusual. And again, this indicates the status that the queens had.
The design is similar to another coin minted a generation earlier by another great female monarch, Cleopatra of Egypt. She's flanked by her lover, the Roman general Mark Antony. Hidden deep in the hills to the south of Petra, there is another sacred site. Most people who visit the city never see this place, but it hides extraordinary evidence of the unusual relationship between the Nabatean king and queen. They may have been more than just husband and wife. According to controversial new findings, these rulers engaged in a practice that is taboo and deeply controversial: incest. The rock-cut city of Petra still stands today, like a golden gemstone in the mountains of eastern Jordan. Ancient writings show that the Nabatean queens of this city had great power and influence. In the hills to the south lies one of Petra's most unusual sacred sites, a small chapel carved from the rock. Inside the chapel, there is a niche where a statue once stood. On a rafter overhead, carved words reveal that people came here to worship the god Obidas. The inscription also invokes Aretas, king of the Nabateans, and his wife Shakwalat. And it reveals something intriguing. The queen, Shakwalat, was known by the title Maliki. This means simply absolute ruler. But there is something shocking to modern eyes. The inscription says that the king and queen were not just a married couple, they were brother and sister.
Now, the first thing that jumped to mind for scholars when they saw this was a comparison with Ptolemaic Egypt, where brother-sister marriage was the normal thing, and it was regarded as being part of the religion and part of the consolidation of the dynasty.
The Ptolemaic kings and queens ruled Egypt for 300 years before the birth of Christ. For many of these monarchs, incest was an everyday reality. The famous Cleopatra had 2 successive husbands who were also her brothers. She ruled alongside these men, and when they died, she ruled alone. Cleopatra may have practiced incest to be like the gods and goddesses of Egypt, like Isis, who married her brother, Osiris. And this could also explain why Nabatean queens practiced incest, so they too could come closer to the gods. Down through history, most monarchs and civilizations have regarded incest as unthinkable. But the evidence suggests the rulers of Ptolemaic Egypt and ancient Nabatea deemed it acceptable. Solar alignments, images of a mighty goddess, royal coins, legal records, and inscriptions on ancient sacred sites. Taken together, this evidence reveals much about ancient Nabatea, a time and place where women enjoyed great privilege and power. But the evidence is circumstantial. The full history of Nabatea remains unknown.
It's tantalizing with the Nabateans. We have so little of their own records, and we grasp at legends on coins and what other people write about them. So it's very difficult to weave together a complete tapestry until we find that perhaps lost annals of the Nabatean kings.
But one thing is certain. Women in Petra and Hegra enjoyed far greater freedoms than they did in Greece or Rome. This was a society unlike any other in the ancient world. What became of this utopia? The answer could lie in the seeming fulfillment of a biblical prophecy. In the Old Testament, Nabatea is called the land of Edom. The books of Jeremiah and Ezekiel record that God cursed Edom. The country was to be laid waste. Fortresses and palaces would lie desolate and abandoned. In the 4th century AD, it seemed that these prophecies were coming true.
There was an earthquake in 363 that seems to have devastated not just Petra, but much of the regions of modern-day southern Palestine, Jordan, and Israel. And we know this especially from the archaeological remains in Petra, where we see not only at the Temple of the Winged Lions, but other excavated structures where large amounts of the monument collapsed in place. And that destruction seems to have categorically changed life in Petra.
Soon afterwards, the ravaged city was inundated by a great flood.
But that's not to say that the city ceased to exist or was abandoned altogether. We know very much that several centuries later, there was a vibrant Christian community that was living at Petra.
Maybe the Nabateans believed that the catastrophe predicted in the Bible had come true. Maybe they feared further devastation and thought it was time to change their gods. Whatever the reason, many of them cast aside their old religion and began to practice Christianity. In 447 AD, the urn tomb was consecrated as a Christian cathedral. Christianity was now the official religion of the Roman Empire. But some still clung to vestiges of the old religion. In remote corners of the forgotten kingdom of Nabatea, they continued to worship Al-Uzza and her sister goddesses Alat and Manat. Then, 200 years later, another dynamic religion swept through the Middle East, Islam. The Prophet Muhammad was the driving force of this new religion. Like the Christians who came before him, he preached the language of patriarchy.
What happened, how these goddesses were phased out after the arrival of Islam, we're not very well informed about. It seems to have been a gradual but rather precipitous decline, and eventually monotheistic Islam spread quite rapidly.
With the coming of the new religion, the time of these three goddesses was at an end. In Islam, there can be no god but Allah. In 630 AD, the Prophet Muhammad ordered the idol of Al-Uzza near Mecca to be destroyed. Once, she had been a great goddess, known far and wide as the most powerful one. Now she was demoted to the status of a mere angel, a daughter of Allah. Surprisingly, she was not killed off. Rather than destroy the old deities, the Prophet and his followers realized that it was easier to assimilate them into their new religion. The community of powerful women that had existed throughout the Nabatean realm had gone forever. But the Bedouin people of Jordan still showed traces of their Nabatean heritage. The women who lived traditional lives under the rocky heights of Petra do not forget their age-old heritage. The women of ancient Nabatea are no more, but traces of their amazing world still remain in the fabulous sacred sites of Petra and Hegra.